Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. Um, Thank you so much for joining us at relatively short notice. And with that, we would like to start by apologizing for only sending some of these invites during the course of this week. As you know, it's the end of the year, and there's lots of sort of reports that need to be written, meetings to be had. So we do apologize for that. Just in terms of process, so this is the second of two feedback webinars that we have organized. The first was yesterday, and the agenda for both days has been exactly the same. So the idea was to have two webinars, which provides people sort of two opportunities to join, listen in, and most importantly, voice their views on how sort of they see 2025 possibly unfolding. In addition to these two webinars, we will prepare just a short clip based on recordings from these webinars. And those short clips will also be disseminated widely. We will share the link to those with you. And the idea is if you know of other organizations that would have wanted to be part of today or yesterday's conversations but weren't able to because of calendar limitations, please do share those recordings with them, because I think one of the core principles of the C20 is to leave no one behind. So without taking up too much of your time, I just want to give us an overview of the purpose of today's session. Um, so you'll see from what's being shared on the screen that what we want to cover today is firstly feedback on, I think, what has happened since the workshop in October. To those of you that aren't aware of the workshop in October, Afrodad, Oxfam South Africa, Economic Justice Network, um, among multiple partners, hosted a workshop in October in Johannesburg. The purpose of that workshop was to bring civil society actors from South Africa, from the continent, and globally to share information on this moment that South Africa finds itself in, where it is now president of the G20 for 2025. So the purpose of that workshop was, I think, to share as much information to say, this is the opportunity that exists, but also to be practical and pragmatic and saying, within this opportunity, these are the limitations. This is the power we have. This is the influence that we might have. Um, Subsequent to that workshop, the G20 Social Summit happened in Brazil, as well as the C20 Summit. Both happened in Rio. And after that, there was a session hosted by South Africa's Ministry of International Affairs, popularly known as DIRCO. Um, so that's what we're going to be covering in today's session. I think feedback on what's happened. And then more importantly, we want to hear everyone's views on what happens next. So we're going to hear about what could happen next in the so-called outsider track, as well as the so-called insider track. I think we will sort of display some options of what could happen next. But what you really want to get from the next 90 minutes is a sense from the people on this call on how they feel this process needs to unfold. So without taking up further time, I'm going to hand over to Sekotlane, who's just going to spend a few minutes setting the scene in terms of where we are as South Africa, as Africa, and as the global South. So over to you, Sekotlane.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Tatenda. It's really great to be here and so great to see so many of you here today. Yesterday we had a ton of people, and today we're seeing a big chunk of you also here again. So it's really great to see that as we try to build this platform for engagement. There's a lot of real engagement from our friends, comrades, and partners from South Africa, in the region, and across the world. So just in terms of scene setting, I've been asked to provide a scene setting overview of where we are and some of the challenges that we're faced with. just to kind of orient ourselves around what we're dealing with and how we might want to think about going about facing the challenge ahead of us over the next year and perhaps the next 4 to 5 years to come. So the world today faces an unprecedented confluence of crises that demand urgent and coordinated action, as we know. As civil society, our engagement with the G20 must center on the critical issues exacerbating global inequalities, threatening our shared humanity, and jeopardizing our planet's future. We're living in this absurd reality where the wealthiest 10% command over 50% of global income, while the poorest half struggles with a mere 8%. This glaring disparity is not only a morally indefensible set of circumstances that we find ourselves in, but also economically destabilizing. Austerity measures driven by sovereign debt crises compound this inequality by stripping communities of essential social protections. The G20 has to prioritize policies that reverse austerity and bolster investment in multidimensional poverty reduction. Now, sovereign debt crises, particularly in the majority world, have hindered nations' ability to respond to the twin emergencies of climate change and social inequality. Countries like Zambia and Kenya bear the burden of unsustainable debt, leaving them unable to finance climate adaptation or sustain social safety nets. We must advocate for G20 support to restructure sovereign debt equitably, enabling nations to channel resources into climate resilience, health, and education. The era of unchecked tax evasion and illicit financial flows must also end. Domestic resource mobilization through progressive taxation is critical for national development. However, this requires global tax cooperation to ensure multinational corporations and super wealthy elites pay their fair share. The G20 must lead efforts to create a fairer international taxation system, as well as closing loopholes that perpetuate inequality. Development financing institutions must also evolve to meet the scale of today's crises. The G20 should champion reforms within multilateral development banks and vertical funds to prioritize sustainable development, address systemic risks, and support the global south in achieving economic and climate justice. Now, much of what I've shared so far with you today has had to do with the structure of the global economy. This is not because I believe we should care about the economy for its own sake, but to reinforce the very reasonable and rational point that the economy is care. Care for the marginalized and vulnerable, like us here in the majority world. Care for the future of young people in a planet deep in climate crisis. Care for women, the elderly, and queer and Black people of the world who are the primary victims of war, trade, and macrofiscal policy choices that have deadly implications. Like we agreed in our October meeting, our stake in the G20 process is to safeguard our moral right to energy, bread, and water. It is to assert our entitlements to global peace and security, health equity, and relieving women and girls of the gendered burden of care and availability to violence. It is to advance our commitment to dismantling the oppressive economic structures triggered by half a millennium of European colonial conquest, extraction, and exploitation that persists through the very structure of the economy across the world, as well as right here at home. Now, in launching South Africa's presidency of the G20 platform on Tuesday, the president reminded us of what the G20 is. Firstly, it is a platform that comprises the world's largest developing and developed economies, which account for 85% of global GDP and 75% of international trade. Secondly, it was established to tackle pressing global economic and financial issues, which the grouping's command of the world economy therefore enables them to play a critical role in influencing global policymaking and fostering global economic stability. The G20 represents a unique platform where the wealthiest and most influential nations and economic blocs can take decisive action. As civil society, we must demand bold commitments to solidarity, equality, and sustainability. We must remind the G20 leaders that their decisions must reflect the collective aspirations of humanity, prioritizing the most vulnerable and ensuring a future where no one is left behind. Through our we also have to be realistic about our ability to influence it. Ours is not so much to steer the center of the G20's government to government platform in the Sherpa and finance tracks, although we will fight hard to do so. We know that not even the South African government by itself has the power to make these systemic shifts that we need, and that much of the ambitions we may share and have been building with the Global South member nations and economic blocs in the first 20-year cycle of the G20 platform will likely be hollowed out. Worse yet, the next nation in the Troika will be the USA under Trump in 2026, followed by Argentina under Milei in 2027. Both have already given us a clear indication of what is at risk if we allow the rising red tide of nationalism and white supremacist and patriarchal repression that serves the prevailing economic elites of the world to wash over the world. I dare even say that we're already crossing the threshold. Germany and France are fragmenting and sinking even deeper into the right. There is instability in South Korea, and Russia is at war. These are among the most significant reasons why this moment demands of us to build a C20 platform that is inclusive and global in character, a platform that is collaborative and committed to continuing the progressive agenda that has been led by our predecessors. Significantly, we must build a united C20 platform that is not only transparent in how it is formed as well as in how it works, but that is principled in being guided by a commitment to human rights, gender equality, and racial justice. The time for incremental change has passed. The time for transformative action is now. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. It was quite motivational, quite inspirational. Yeah, I definitely feel goosebumps in terms of, I think, this moment that we find ourselves in as South African civil society. So the next part of this webinar is going to be a very brief update on, I guess, what has happened since that kickoff workshop in October. I hope everyone can see my screen. If not, please shout. So a range of activities and I think processes have unfolded since October. The first is I think the organizations that hosted that workshop set up an expression of interest form or EOI form. And the purpose of that form was, I think, to recognize firstly that, you know, as much as we had 140 civil society organizations at that workshop, you know, percent of the universe, right? We know that unfortunately we weren't able to reach every single organization in South Africa, and we definitely didn't reach all of the ones in Africa and globally. And the C20 really needs to be something that is sort of connected to global movement. So we have had this EOI form open for over a month. And I think the two main questions we asked were whether organizations would like to be involved and what sector they were in. So in terms of whether organizations wanted to be involved, what's nice, and you can see it from the screen, is there's a good mix in terms of organizations that want to be involved in the C20, which is the so-called formal, you know, engagement grouping of the G20 for civil society. But at the same time, there are also, you know, almost 200 organizations that put their hand up and said they want to be involved in the so-called outsider track, which is typically involved with, you know, public mobilization, public education, and sometimes protest action. So there was, I think, a nice showing there. In terms of which sectors these organizations are from, what's interesting is I think the highest number of responses was from the education sector. And when we say education, it's not necessarily sort of, these massive foundations that are, maybe providing scholarships and so on. But it was in many cases grassroots um, civil society organizations that in different sectors help to capacitate citizens, rights holders, and in some cases, even duty bearers. And these do this from the lenses of youth, from the lenses of gender, from the lenses of sort of child rights, and so on. So it was really nice, I think, to see the education sector taking a prominent role in terms of the responses we got. I think other big things that responded to this EOI are climate and environmental justice, health, and marginalized and vulnerable populations. And what we really liked is where the G20 is typically seen as a space for sort of central bank governors, finance ministers. What we see from the forum is civil society from across different interest groups is interested and is putting their hands up to say, we also want to be part of this journey. So that's the first thing that's happened since the workshop in October. In terms of other things that have happened, so the Brazilian C20 hosted a C20 summit in Rio, and that summit was amazingly successful. I think there were several hundred participants from Brazil, from South Africa. I know there were at least 20 participants, probably many more. And it was quite a festive event where the Brazilian C20 was able to show the amazing work that they had done over the previous 12 months. They were able to show the policy packs that they had prepared and that they had presented to the leaders of the G20 and their presidency as well. And in addition to this C20 summit, there was G20 Social. So this is a nice innovation that was promulgated by the Brazilian presidency and the Brazilian Ministry of Finance. And the idea there was where the G20 summit is often seen as sort of a closed off space. They really wanted to open up and say citizens need to engage with the G20 in various forms. And we saw a good sort of representation from groups such as children, groups such as persons living with disabilities, and that was amazing. And I think it's interesting to see that the South African government on Monday announced formally that they would want to continue this tradition that the Brazilian presidency has introduced. So that's quite nice. And then the third update that I'd like to mention is that last week, an invite was sent out by the South African Ministry of Foreign Affairs or International Relations, commonly known as DIRCO. And they sent out the invites, unfortunately, a bit late. So there was, I think, a quite vocal response from civil society to say, thank you so much for the invites, but in future, please send these invites earlier and maybe send these invites to a bigger pool of participants. But I think it was a nice moment in that the Minister of Foreign Affairs was there, the Sue Sherpa were there. They spent a few minutes talking about how they want to engage or how they would like to engage with civil society. And I think more importantly, there was quite a lot of space for civil society to sort of start saying, these are our asks. This is what we would like to see from you in the course of 2025 and beyond. So yeah, I think those are the three sort of moments that I would like to speak to. I'm going to hand over to Jenny. Jenny is first going to speak about the People's Summit, which took place in Rio. And I think after that, she's going to link that to what the outside track could look like for us in South Africa next year. So over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Tatenda, and morning, everyone. Really, really great to see so many faces here again today. So I'll talk briefly about the People's Summit in Rio, as Tatenda said. So few of us were fortunate enough to be there, and People's Summits come from a long tradition They are quite a typical thing that is organized when a G20 is in a particular country. There's a long, rich tradition of that. And Brazil, with its social movement, huge tradition of social movements, labor unions, very vibrant civil society is, of course, no exception to that. So the People's Summit is very much on the outside track. It's something that is organized independently, autonomously. It is not part of the official engagement platforms with the G20. So it's important to know it is a separate thing. So in the case of Brazil, what we had the opportunity to exchange, very generous exchange with Brazilian comrades who'd been at the heart of the organizing and welcomed us in the People's Summit itself. It was the result of a year-long process. So I think we can not underestimate the work that it takes to put something like that together. Social movements from across the sort of different sectors, identity groups, marginalized groupings, and so on in Brazil were working with each other over the course of a year to put it together. That involved a lot of political education work in the different movements across Brazil and trying to work collaboratively to come together around a declaration, a sort of shared agenda. The People's Summit itself was a beautiful day, a combination of cultural inputs, different discussions, workshops, food, a sort of beautiful day that you would expect in a kind of movement setting where the politics and the praxis of that country kind of comes alive, and that discourse about that more critical discourse about both about the G20 and what it represents currently, the system that it is a product of, that sharp critique and that alternative viewpoint about the economies, the societies that we want is very vocal and visible in a summit like that. So it was a really, really beautiful day to be a part of. And, you know, the Brazilians very much were handing over the expectation that South Africa will continue that tradition as it was handed over to them from India and Indonesia before them. So that was a fantastic day to be a part of. The other thing to note that was different about Brazil's G20 was President Lula introduced a new element to the G20 called the G20 Social, which was partly coming from his relationship with the unions and the movements, which is his political base, his political home, if you will, and partly due to the politics in country, the rise of the far right, which Brazil has been experiencing sharply, but is certainly true in many, many countries across both global north and global south, of course. And wanting for there to be a space where social movements were engaged with in a more formal sense. Now, this was introduced partway through the process when movements had been organizing around the People's Summit, and then effectively there was a split because President Lula invited or wanted movements and unions to engage in the official G20 social space. And so that split the big movements and unions in Brazil and caused quite a lot of tension as to when who was going to position themselves where, when the marches were taking place, started to clash with dates when Lula wanted to go and engage with people inside the G20 social space. So that was a very particular phenomenon that happened in Brazil's G20. Lula did request that the South African presidency continue the tradition of a G20 social. So it's going to be something for us to watch and to strategize around right from the beginning. If the South African government, as they're currently saying at a high level, they intend to continue that tradition because it has the potential to be quite divisive. And parts of the movement are very insistent that movements and civil society also needs that autonomous space that isn't an official platform or space hosted by government. So that's just something that was very important to know as a big lesson. Okay, so then let me move on to a little bit about the outsider space and the typical outsider activities that might happen around a big international moment like a G20 summit. Of course, there is a long tradition. These outsider mobilizations sit within a broader political history that, it stems from the early 2000s. We've seen big kind of global solidarity movements around key issues of economic, racial justice, feminist issues, that the typical sort of broader popular protest that can spring up around a G20 summit is part of that history and tradition. And for those of you that were at the workshop we had in Johannesburg, and I know many of you weren't, but you can have access to the report. I think comrades have pasted it in the chat, so all of that is accessible. Trevor Ngwane gave us a really good oral history of the traditions and the victories and also the challenges of that movement trajectory since the early 2000s in the anti-globalization area. Typical G20 protest action sits within that broader history. And then typically the types of outsider activities that happen do give expression to those broader, connecting people's everyday struggles and inequalities that are very real and pressing in a day-to-day fashion, with the big macroeconomic issues, the big geopolitical issues that shape our lives. Something that a G20, as Sikwetlani said in the introduction, those big macro issues, your tax, your debt, the big drivers of austerity in our countries and so on, that so affect people on the ground, give voice to that alternative viewpoint and vision. So some of the typical activities you might see are a big, broad internationalist people's summit, like the one that was held in Brazil. There will very typically be big street protest around the time of the G20 summit itself. There might be protest and outsider action earlier on in the year. The G20 is a year-long process for any country to hold. And of course, what happens around the Leaders' Summit itself in November, a lot of that is political theater. Hard decisions around issues, the substantive issues are made earlier on in the year. So sometimes the outsider work where we know a certain issue isn't getting any traction politically in the G20. Candidates for that this year under the South African presidency, we already know there's a not so much political will behind the agenda Brazil drove on taxing the rich, for example. We're already concerned about where the political traction is on debt, for example, with this being the first African presidency of the G20. Those things, and potentially others, of course, may need a hard outsider push much earlier on in the year. Other activities would include cultural engagements, more of your mass-based engagement, a huge program of political education work, so people can connect what this G20 thing is to their life and their place in the economy. A big international show comes to town for a time and it leaves again. But what does it mean to people? Are we doing radio shows in local languages across the country and across other parts of the global south? Are we doing community level engagements? And then around a G20 summit, there will also typically be a huge number of activities that organizations or movements want to do individually. So there'll be those big collective pieces where it's a show of strength and collaboration. And then people will want to do things on their own. There could be art exhibitions. There could be panel discussions. There could be hundreds of different events that organizations will want to host themselves. So just wrapping up, in terms of process, the outsider work, as you would imagine, it's not like the C20 process where you have your formal engagement groups and there'll be a discussion about that with for the rest of the session, basically, after we wrap up this bit about how South Africa wants to proceed on that front. The outsider work is basically a coalition of the willing, where aligned or broadly aligned groups, movements come together to explore what makes sense and what people want to organize together and how they want to do it and so on. So I would suggest in the expression of interest form, there was an option to say that you wanted to be involved in mobilization and education activities. That relates to what I've just described, those types of outsider activities, or perhaps other ones that people want to take on. So I would suggest if you haven't filled in the expression of interest form, and that's interesting and relevant to you, your movement, your organization, then do fill it in. And then I think in January, I think the chance to start any real convening around that for 2024 is not realistic. We can pull people together for a kickoff meeting early in 2025, sometime in January, and then people can define the process that they want to take on from there. So thanks, Tatenda. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much for that, Jenny. I love the fact that you spoke about things like radio shows. Often as a society, we get so bogged down in sort of these 100-page reports, and we forget that our work is ultimately to represent the person on the street. And the person on the street is way more likely to listen to a radio show in their mother tongue or in their native tongue than they are to read a 100-page document. So I really enjoyed those options that you provided. So Mandla, I'm going to hand over to you. Jenny has spoken about how the G20 is often a lot of political theater. We as civil society want to influence the script of that theater. And the C20 is one of the ways in which we want to do that. So perhaps you can just talk about how this moment is different for South Africa compared to the previous C20s in other countries. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about what the options could be for us as civil society to organize and figure out, what are our working groups, who is our so-called leadership, and that, those kind of issues. So I'm going to hand over to you, Mandla.
Right. Thank you so much, Tatenda, and thanks, Jenny, for really giving me a soft landing. So we're talking about representing people or how people are represented within the G20. We know that the G20 is government and so on, but how are the people's voices represented within this process? They are represented through the C20 or Civil 20, which is an official engagement group of the G20. It's an official space, which means that it is recognized by members of the G20 and has been since 2013. It means people have been able to participate and have their voices heard alongside the government process since 2013. So who is represented when we talk about civil society? I think this is very important to know who will make up the C20. It will be any organization. And for South Africa, as you rightfully put it, Tatenda, it's going to be a very big moment. It's not just going to be South African and NGOs and civil society, but because the AU is going to be participating, it means it's also a big moment for Africa. It's the first time that the G20 is being hosted on the continent, and it means that it is an opportunity for South Africa to showcase itself among its neighbors and among South Africa has always been the doorway for most African countries into the G20, BRICS, and other multilateral situations. So this is an opportunity now for Africa to come to South Africa and be participatory and be active within that space. What the Civil 20 or the C20 in South Africa is going to do is provide a soft landing spot for most civil society. And in order to do this, it's important for us to define what happens and what are the principles that guide our participation as civil society. So civil society includes any organization, be it international or networks, local associations, groups, and social movements. they must be fully independent from government. In other words, we do not need a situation where a government, and this has happened, by the way, in other countries, where a government creates civil society in order to limit further the civil society space. And this happens in different settings. So in the case of C20, civil society are usually those organizations that are aligned to human and environmental rights, and those that defend public goods and interests. So it's important to define the criteria of the type of organizations that should see themselves aligning themselves to the C20. And it's not easy to do this. It's not easy to sift through the organizations, for instance, that have shown interest through the expression of interest and find out which ones are genuinely aligned to human rights and so forth. So to do this, it's the C20 that met in Japan in 2019 developed what are called the C20 principles. And according to these principles, the practice should be that civil society of the hosting country, in other words, what we here in South Africa have to do is look carefully through the lists and so on that have shown interest, and from there, at least be able to allow into the space those organizations who are aligned to our cause, to our values, and then to also now from within those organizations be able to choose a leadership and so on that will take us into the C20 process. The first principle that is developed, it says that the C20 is a global space for civil society organizations from all over the world, as I've just indicated, that it's not just for South Africa in this case, but it's for international NGOs and grassroots and local groups whose aim is to influence the G20. Any local, regional, or international organization, whether from a G20 or non-G20 country, wishing to discuss major issues in the global agenda and wanting to have an impact on the G20 is welcome to participate in the C20. There should, of course, be a regional and gender balance in our participation. The second principle is transparency. All preliminary working drafts of C20 pronouncements or decisions should be circulated widely among participating organizations and open to comment. And all final documents should be made widely available and accessible. In other words, we will need to be as transparent as possible. We will need to be as participatory and ensure that we leave no one behind in sharing information. All C20 outputs must be developed through a transparent, inclusive, and participatory process to provide participating civil society organizations the opportunity to collaborate in drafting policy recommendations. So we are going to encourage a lot of collaboration, a lot of, especially through the working groups that are going to be established. Once approved, further editing or review of the content of any documents prepared by the C20 working groups or the C20 steering committee and international advice will not be allowed. Approved documents can only be lightly edited for language clarity and design purposes. And this is to ensure that there is transparency. The third principle is about independence. While welcoming input and open debate, ultimate decision-making and sign-off prerogatives on C20 positions belong to C20 member organizations. The C20 is the exclusive domain of civil society, mandated to carry out its work and develop its policy recommendations autonomously. That is free from undue influence by any non-civil society actors. As I already indicated, we do not want to be influenced by our governments. Collaboration. To address issues of common interest, the C20 should cooperate with other engagement groups. There are going to be other engagement groups that have already been set up and that have their own space, such as the L20, the Labor 20, the Think Tank 20, the Business 20, the Women's 20, and the Youth 20. There are lots of groups like that whose purpose is to enhance the impact of the C20's work. Such cooperation must be based on balanced power relations, adequate consultation among C20 members, and with agreement of the C20 Steering Committee and International Advisory Committee. The fifth element, human rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment. The C20 should identify existing inequalities, forms of discrimination, and other human rights violations, and strongly request G20 governments to tackle gender and other inequalities, promoting the empowerment of women and girls, men and boys, both at country and global level. Number 6 is inclusiveness. The C20 is a space of meaningful exchange and cross-country collaboration, which does not tolerate any form of discrimination, including on the basis of geographic location, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, caste, language, age, ability, legal status, e.g. migrant, refugee, and statelessness, or on ideology, religion, or political beliefs. The C20 will use innovative, cost-efficient, and practical approaches, including the use of ICTs, e.g. webcasting, video conferencing, and other online tools in order to foster greater and more diverse participation of civil society actors. So in other words, we'll use a plethora of tools that we have developed over the years to make sure that this is a showcase and that everybody is able to participate according to their abilities and capabilities. Number 7 is continuity. Although the overall themes and priorities of the C20 may vary from year to year, and I think the government has put out its calendar, which shows some of the themes that will be covered, all C20 processes should be guided by the aim of reflecting the perspective and experience of civil society across a diverse range of topics, including those which civil society wants the G20 to address, but are not currently on the G20 agenda. So we can go beyond the scope of what government has described or has prescribed. For that to happen, each C20 process should always build on its predecessors, in this case, Brazil, and ensure that the voices and experience from different parts of the world are taken into account. If you look at the participation that we have today, and you look into our chat, you will realize that we already have so many different and diverse participants today from different countries. So it's very, very encouraging. The C20 structure outlined is viewed as essential for maintaining this continuity. In order to ensure continuity, the current C20 chair, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, will transfer the domain of the C20 website and social media to the following C20 chair as the G20 presidency is transferred. So the G20 presidency has been passed to South Africa from Brazil, and from South Africa it will be passed on to the United States. And thus the C20, a few of us went to Brazil and received the baton from Brazilian civil society organizations. And from there, we are taking the momentum into building this fantastic C20 that's going to be in South Africa. The principle number 8 is predictability. In order to contribute to the transparency of the C20, it is crucial to have clear schedules and processes in place that outline a step-by-step approach for every deliverable product that will be produced for the publication on behalf of the C20. And I think this is the process that we are in. We are in the process of identifying a leadership that will guide our participation, that will guide the products that we will put out collectively, and guide us into how we create a landing space for fellow civil society organizations from different countries that will be converging in South Africa. So how exactly are we going to do this? In what format does the inside track work? Well, it works through working groups, which are thematic spaces where civil society organizations from all over the world will meet in person or online in order to discuss and produce policy papers aimed at providing concrete recommendations and policy proposals targeting the G20. Collectively, these groups will comprise all of civil society organizations, both domestic and international, who are interested in participating actively in the C20 process. Each working group will have will be coordinated by 2 or more organizations, one international at least, and at least one local or national, with a relevant experience and or expertise on the subjects debated within the working group. In other words, once we decide what the working groups are going to be, we need these working groups to be functional, and for them to be functional, they have to have solid leadership, which is going to rely heavily on expertise and experience and so on. But these are the most important. This is the heart of the C20, because the working groups are going to produce the work that is going to feed into the G20. So to ensure that the C20 maintains its legitimacy as a representative of international civil society community, the steering committee must have an outreach plan to encourage the participation of a diverse range of CSOs from across the world to join and participate in the C20 and its working groups. So the leaders of the working groups are going to form the steering committee, which is going to essentially lead the work that is going to feed into the G20. And now it brings us to the point where we are as South Africans. We now must produce a leadership that is going to take charge of the C20 and lead us into the work that must and is inevitably coming to us. It's going to be heavy lifting, because the work that is going to be done by the working groups is going to be quite heavy, as it covers quite a lot of the thematic areas that we've spoken about. Now, what does this ideal leadership look like? It should be organizations that have been that have a history of engagement and participation in the C20. So it should be organizations that have at least an idea of what the C20 seeks to achieve and what the C20 relationship with the G20 should look like. And it should be organizations that hopefully have organizational capacity, because it's going to be not only gathering together South African civil society, but you're going to be gathering even civil society from across the continent, as well as international from G20 member countries. The lead organizations should at least be familiar with the national space, should be familiar with what South African civil society look like, and have an idea of how to interact and create cohesive ambitions, at least society. And where I was talking about caution is that the civil society organizations that are going to lead us need to have financial and administrative capacity, because there's going to be a lot of resources that are going to be needed to mobilize civil society for the C20, and must also be able to create political conditions to relate and have national political dialogue with the government, because the government is going to guide us through the Sherpa on how to engage with G20 member countries, and especially when we are making our input from the thematic areas that we've discussed. There's also going to be an outreach, and therefore the leadership should at least have familiar with internal work and be able to engage with CSOs from across the world. And then the most important ingredient to our coming together is national consensus and inclusive approach. So all the C20 organizations, or the organizations that have shown interest, will be able to pick the leadership that they envisage will bring them together for this kind of work. If we had an umbrella organization in South Africa, as we used to, the South African, I think it was a national Sangoko or some such, some countries have national umbrellas of NGOs. The task would be given to them to convene us, because they would have a register of all organizations in South Africa. But in this case, we are doing it ourselves, and we are trying to do it gently, cautiously and intentionally, because we want the C20 to be a success. So I think with these words, Chair, let me end it here and just say those were the principles of the C20 and the principles that we should try to adhere to as we try to create a space for other organizations to join us for the C20. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much for that, Mandla. It's a lot of information, but I think it's necessary that we hear it so that we're all on the same page. So for the next 35 minutes or the last 30 minutes of this webinar, our hope is participation from the 60 odd people on the call. I think for the last 50 minutes, we've been sharing quite a lot of information. We know it's a lot to digest. But what we want to hear from you is sort of how it resonates. Does it make sense? What are the next steps? Who should be involved in those next steps? And when should those steps be taken by? So Mandla, I think just to summarize, and I think to sort of kick off the question and answer is, Mandla spoke about working groups and leadership. In terms of working groups, he said the working groups must have expertise within those domain knowledge areas. And those working groups must have a mix of local, South African, and international participants. So that's the working groups. We want expertise, we want international and local. Mandla also spoke about the leadership of the C20. And there, Mandla mentioned that it's not a popularity contest. It's not about sort of, I have the most money or the most signature or sort of, the biggest organization. He says consensus has to be reached in terms of whether the leadership is familiar with the national space, whether the leadership is able to dialogue with the government, whether the leadership has administrative capacity, because I think it's sort of 100 meetings throughout the year that need to be coordinated. And unfortunately, because of the world we live in, there also needs to be consensus that the leadership has financial capacity to do all of these things. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a Q&A section. I know we invite your constructive criticism, and we really love it when that constructive criticism is offering a solution to say, okay, this is a potential gap, but maybe we can do it this way. This is how we can resolve this. This is how we can get to where we want to be. So what I would request is if people have the ability to talk, that they put their hands up within the app, and then they can talk. We know sometimes people, for various reasons, aren't able to talk, in which case we ask that people also type their questions or their suggestions within the chat section of this app. And just as a sort of administrative point, I am aware that in the chat, we have been reminded that in terms of accessibility, we definitely need to do better. Some of the options have been that we could use Google Meet, we could use Teams, because I think the closed caption functionality is currently better. So that's something we will explore in future calls. And I think also, there was a mention of the inclusion of sign language translation or interpretation. So apologies about that gap, but I think in future engagements, that's something we will plan adequately for. So I see two hands. Let's first hear from David and then Kanyisile. And then if more hands come up, we will field those. Thanks, David.
Hi, thanks. I'm just checking if I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
But thank you so much. And I think thank you so far for the coordination work that all the organizations hosting this have been doing. It's deeply appreciated, particularly for an organization like Mobilize, where we've never engaged in a G20 or C20 process before this year, when we got to engage in a bit of the Brazil ones. There are three big, broad questions I have. First is, whether informal or informal, I want to get an understanding of how is the C20 process going to relate to other 20 processes. So I'm talking about like Business 20, Think Tank 20, Labor 20, others. I know in some of the spaces that I've been interacting, there's a lot of conversation about about what are the possible collaborations, be it informal or formal. The next question is, I sort of sit in a position still where I'm not sure which is the best pathway for our organization in terms of inside or outside a track. Both have an appeal in a sense. And I think a lot of what that is understanding, getting a better understanding of where are the capacity gaps that we could say fill, right? So, what are roles that need to be filled that no one is currently filling? What can we do that wouldn't be redundant? And I was wondering if, as we dive into next year, whether we could have really quite deep explorations about what is the capacity needed. And I'm referring to financial, but also not financial, right? In terms of, we're talking about radio, for example, organizations that are connected with community radio stations that know how to go and get dozens and dozens of community radio interviews done. Has capacity been identified to do that? Is this something that's still being looked for? So maybe I'm sort of putting the cart before the horse here, but wondering about next year in those early workshops we're talking about is, do we sort of plan to get these sort of questions answered and have an effective sort of distribution of capacity by sort of the end of January, or is it still to be seen? But thanks, that's it from me.
Thanks, David. I think let's do several questions at a time. Where possible, we will answer in the Q&A. So next is Dr. Kanyisile Litchfield Chabalala, after which we'll hear from Eric Lucas and then Kelvin Glenn.
Thank you, Tatenda, and I think thank you, Afrodat, Oxfam, and the others for the work that you've done on this process thus far. I just want to ask a question from what Comrade Mandla said about the lead organizations. Everything that he said, I agree with. There's just a slight concern. Organizations that would have had experience with dealing with the C20. How will people build experience if they're not included is my question. So while I agree that in the broader sense, you need those organizations, for the process to go on. But what are you going to do to take along organizations that do not have that experience, but that you take along for, passing on the knowledge? Two, how are we what process have you put in place? Or is that the process we should all put in place in terms of how we are going to say it's okay for these organizations to lead? That process should be inclusive, transparent. I already can say upfront from the workshop we held in Joburg, I have no issues with Afrodat or with Oxfam leading the process, but how are we going to get to actually saying the process was inclusive? We all voted, these are the organizations that we selected. And then three, I represent a very important stakeholder here, members of parliament who are in 49 African countries, and these are volunteer members of parliament who are volunteering to fight illicit financial flows from Africa. I'm struggling, I think, like the last speaker, in terms of where do we fit in? Because I think at the end of the day, we need to keep this conversation alive in the South African parliament too, towards the time. But how do we fit in? We have expressed an interest to be part of the process, obviously, because I think when all is said and done, things are legislative. So we have a very important role to play. But I think I'm struggling to just say, where exactly do we fit in? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kanyisile. So we have two more hands, Eric and then Calvin. Sorry, Eric, I can see you're talking, but we currently can't hear you.
Sorry.
Yes,
Good morning.
perfect.
Sorry. Good morning. I don't know if it's the right place, and I already wrote something in the chat. It is about the G20 for disability. And here in Brazil, we, as the Autistan Diplomatic Organization of autistic people, we have participated quite a lot in the C20. We and the other organizations of persons with disabilities, we have noted that the framework of the C20 is very good, but it's not really adapted for persons with disabilities. That we had to struggle just to have the persons with disabilities mentioned with indigenous people and many other vulnerabilized groups. So I don't understand well. Someone explained that the National Council of Persons with Disabilities of South Africa has been approached by the organization here in Brazil, Instituto João Clemente, who initiated the D20. But maybe it has to be also taken care of at another level, maybe, I don't know, to have more chances to have the D20 continue. Sorry, it's a bit difficult for me to explain, but I hope it's possible to understand. Thank you.
Eric, thanks so much for that. I did see your contributions in the chat, and I think what you said sort of built on to that. So it I think quite important for you to speak. So thanks for that. Okay, on the current set we have Kelvin, and then I think we might have a few responses, and then we'll do the next set of hands. So Kelvin, if you can please unmute.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity, and congratulations to the colleagues that have clearly worked really hard to get us where we are today. It's no small feat. So I represent the Resource Alliance, and we work with thousands of charities and movements in the social impact sector around the world, including a lot of focus on the Global South and focus on how we do capacity building and the funding models to keep the social impact sector alive. My question, like the previous colleagues, is I think that there's a space for a section of participation for organizations that represent movements or groups of organizations with a specific thematic theme. Because like we don't fit into a box that any of those boxes you put down, but I think the fact that we work with thousands and thousands of organizations across the globe, looking at how we keep them sustainable and how we push back on there's not enough support and there's not enough funding for the work that the social impact sector does across the globe. And yet, people and governments are putting thousands and thousands into military defense and war. So my question is, for January, when we had the deep dive, is how do we make sure that organizations that are, I would say, movements that are representing thousands and thousands of organizations, how can they be the catalyst? How can Resource Alliance be your catalyst to our database of 50,000 plus to get the message out? And a lot of those are in the Global South. So what I'm really saying is, how do you utilize us as a champion to get your messaging to the wider community of stakeholders so that we do have a true broad spectrum of opinions, but also we get a real clear picture of what the social impact or civil society space needs and wants out of the G20 and the C20. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Kelvin. I think as Mandla said, we definitely want movements on board. We don't want this to be just academic talk where, we're writing these fancy reports. We want the movement. We want the 50K plus. So yes, please walk this journey with us in 2025 and beyond. So I see there are two hands. Before we get to those two hands, there's a question that I want to sort of ask the room to think about, and perhaps the room can type in the chat box and can also put their hands to respond. So the question was from Dr. Kanyisile, who's asking, what is the process in place to figure out who leads, and how do we make sure that process is transparent, and how do we make sure that process is inclusive? Dr. Kanyisile, thank you for, I think, sort of mentioning your sentiments. I do need to say that Afrodad, Oxfam South Africa, from the beginning have made it clear that, we've been holding the space. And the idea is obviously civil society within South Africa would need to sort of decide, do we have a mandate? Do they want that mandate to be with other organizations? So I think that's the first question to the whole room, which is to say, how do we make this leadership sort of identification process transparent and inclusive? And then the second sort of thing I'd want to mention is targeted at a few people that I've seen in the participant list. So I've seen in the participant list, there are a few people whose names sort of have IAC C20 at the end. And what I imagine that means is that they or their organizations were involved in the International Advisory Committee of the C20 at some point. So I would also ask that those people who have IAC C20 also provide us with guidance, because unfortunately it is unknown, unfamiliar terrain for us as South Africa. So obviously we want our process to be based on what works for us, but at the same time we want to link with what the IAC has as sort of best or better practice. So sorry, Onika, I know you've had your hand up. And then after Onika, we can hear from Ricardo, who's also had their hand up for a while. So Onika, if you may please unmute and share.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here and for convening this conversation. So my name is Onika Makwakwa. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership. We're a coalition of multi-stakeholder organizations that are focused on advancing meaningful connectivity for the global majority. We had the opportunity to serve as a technical advisor to Brazil, producing a book actually on universal meaning connectivity and having it adopted at the G20 as one of the core working areas for Brazil. I've observed that South Africa has not picked up that area of universal meaningful connectivity. However, there is artificial intelligence and digital economy, which will not happen inclusively if we don't, power it with universal and meaningful connectivity. So I'm curious to know if there is an appetite for this kind of work. I mean, I think we've done some really great work in Brazil, but we have an opportunity with South Africa, especially given the huge inequalities within the country, to actually now begin to introduce a measurement of how do you actually measure universal meaningful connectivity to ensure, real digital inclusion that goes beyond just kind of, using averages and that kind of stuff. So this would be mostly led through researchers in civil society, academia, and all of that. So I'm going to just pause there and just sort of offer that we are just really curious to know if, there is an interest for this area. We are also developing a specialty in artificial intelligence and human rights, that intersection, which I think is really important as we begin to get more complex in digital economy issues and artificial intelligence advancement, especially for global majority countries. Thank you.
Onika, first, congratulations, I think, on the book that your organization published and on the advisory role you provided to the government of Brazil. In terms of which working groups are sort of selected, I think this consensus approach is going to sort of guide to say, okay, these are the issues that South African civil society identifies. This is what the government of South Africa has identified, and how does that link to international processes? So I think one of the 3 task forces that the government announced on Monday does link to AI. And we've seen in the chats that I think there definitely is quite a lot of sort of knowledge that we all need on, how we use AI, how sometimes, we take things such as consent for granted. So yeah, I think that's a very important sort of intervention. So we have a hand from Ricardo, and then I think I might look at some of the text questions after that. So Ricardo, if you may please unmute.
Yes, Tatenda, thank you. IAC means International Advisory Committee, as you were saying before, and some of us are here in the meeting with you, and we are very happy to share this opportunity with you. We met as advisory committee yesterday, and I just put in the chat a list of possible criteria we agreed on yesterday to maybe even help the process to identify who will have responsibility in the process. From my side, just a couple of suggestions at the light of the experience we had. In fact, in the past, I was the C20 Sherpa in 2029, and then I was a member of the advisory committee in the following years, helping a process in the other steps. The same for Maf, Bini that are here, Anselmo that are here in the meeting with you. The first thing is that I would avoid to speak about leading organization. There is no leader here. We need to facilitate the process. So who will have any kind of responsibility in the process will provide a service to the community of South African civil society organization and of the international civil society in the framework of the Civil 20. And I think that this is important. Mandla said that, but you, Tadenda, as well. This is not a competition or whatever. This is a service. I think that the organization or the organizations that will have this kind of responsibility mustn't be left alone. I mean, the C20 process is not something that is owned by the presidency of the C20. The presidency of the C20 will simply facilitate the process. And this is relevant also for the financial dimension. We do not have how can I say, a format for the financial issues. I mean, it depends on every year. Sometimes the government hosting the G20 process provides some money for the engagement groups, that is a C20, B20, T20, etc., etc. As we can understand, B20 does not need anything because they are companies, they are business, they are private actors, but we have the need, we as civil society, to find resources beyond the possible resources provided by the government. We need to fundraise, and this is a responsibility that normally is in the hands of the civil society of the country, but that I think has to be shared together. It will not just the organization that will be identified as chair or whatever that has to provide this. We have to do it all together, even finding, if possible, some helps from the international community. And in that sense, the third consideration, so first, it is facilitating and it is a service. Second, be careful and let's try to find solidarity in the financial process to fund the process. Third, I think that it's important to move towards a sort of even informal national platform. We have some countries with national platforms that even, I repeat, informal, that help the civil society organization of the country to speak together, to coordinate the advocacy action. And this is helpful in the process of the C20 towards a G20, but it's useful also in the following years to speak with the government on the political agenda, or to find a way, a space to strengthen the voice. In that sense, my last consideration is, or second last, is that independently from the decision that you will take to identify who could put its contribution at the service of the process, it will be important to continue to have meetings like the one of today. That is that the idea is that the civil society of the country has to chair the process, to facilitate the international process. That means that it's not simply a responsibility of the organizations that will have a formal responsibility as chair or Sherpa, but that means that it will be important to have opportunity monthly with the scheduling that you will choose, but to have the opportunity to meet together to see how the process is going on within the country, and to share a bit the idea about how to continue in facilitating the process. Of course, the process will be led by the steering committee and accompanied by the advisory committee. But I think that this dialogue among the organization in the country is relevant and can be, in fact, in perspective, the creation of a sort of platform that will be useful in the following years, because in the following edition of C20, we will have to be able to speak with the national Sherpa of all the members of the G20 group, and having a national platform that continues this follow-up and this advocacy with the government, in this case of South Africa, is useful. I will end here because we don't have too much time. Just a call on the urgency, because the South African government is already working on the issue notes and is already sending the issue notes to the partners of the G20, and we have to be able to talk with them and to influence this kind of process. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ricardo. Yeah, I think your experience clearly shows. So we really appreciate those points that you made. So I think my two main takeaways from what you said were, it's not necessarily leadership, but more a facilitation role. And I think the second takeaway is that there is a sense of urgency about this. So I'd like to hear from the room in terms of next steps. Yeah, who volunteers to do what and when? As I said earlier, Afrodad, Oxfam South Africa, and the other partner organizations have been holding the space. We currently don't have a mandate from the whole of civil society, and we are willing to work with other organizations that put their hand up to say, we want to help facilitate the next steps. We would like for it to happen, in December. We want it to happen in January, and any similar things. I see there is a hand. I'm going to apologize for the poor pronunciation, but the hand is from Mahtuchan, who was the Sherpa for C20 Indonesia in 2022.
Thank you so much, Tatenda. Hi, friends and colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I really happy to meet with you all. Looking at the ongoing process in C20 South Africa presidency, in general, I'm optimistic that you all guys will be able to carry out the mandate as C20 presidency 2025. Your step in conducting survey on issues is very good. This is also what we did in the presidency of Indonesia. Why we need to use the survey? Because we need to ensure that the establishment of working group by C20 based on the most relevant issues in our current situation in the current society. But on the other hand, we need to also ensure the development of working group mirroring of the priority in a G20 presidency. So I think you already have a modality to establish the working group in a good way. The second thing is about the timeline. Based on the previous experiences, the establishment of structure of person that will sit in the structure of a C20 presidency, ideally soon, mid of December, yeah, it will be better. But if you still have you still need a time to make a consensus, I think during whole of December is fine. Yeah. But during the process domestically and rest of African Union, I think we also need to communicate. Yeah, we need to immediately communicate with our colleagues from US CSOs, because they will sit in the troika. Yeah, and we need to ensure the representative CSO from US since the beginning of process in your presidency. So the colleagues from South Africa can start communicate with the CSO from US. But International Advisory Committee of C20 Brazil this year also can contribute to share the list of prospectus civil society in United States. So we need to make a consensus rather than the voting mechanism. And I think one of the uniqueness of Civil 20 and G20 in the broad sense is the consensus mechanism. Regarding the position of African Union, they already admitted as a permanent member of G20 that announced during India presidency 2023. I think the C20 presidency of South Africa should be put a sense of consolidation of CSOs across African continent as well. Yeah, because it is a momentum how to consolidate the voices from across African continent, and shifting from the object of decision-making process in G20 become one of subject to decision-making process at the G20 platform. So my suggestion, ideally, only suggestion, the leadership and the involvement of a civil society organization in C20 South Africa presidency, ideally spread across member state of African Union. Perhaps you need to expand in some countries as much as possible, yeah, to inlining the position of African Union in the G20 platform. I think the criteria they already Ricardo mentioned, it's a basic principle, and we need to making sure that our process follow the consensus criteria they already decide from the previous process. That's all from my side. I'm personally committed to have you all to share our experiences previously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think my takeaways from what you said is, if we can, let's push and get as much progress within December. I do need to let you know that unfortunately in South Africa, we kind of sort of shut down for most of December. So for us, Christmas and the New Year are a very big thing. So we will try for December, but it might spill over into January. So the second takeaway from the intervention was that because the AU has acceded to the G20, it would be good and important to have some representation of civil society from member states. And then the third thing is we should also be looking ahead 12 months to the United States. And I think we obviously know with the Trump government, it's a very different dynamic to the Biden presidency. So I fully agree that we do need to be thinking ahead to say, how do we bring in our colleagues from America in order to ensure continuity? So I'm aware that we've unfortunately run out of time. I know that this is an incredibly busy time of the year. I know that we sent these invites only this week, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I need to thank you for, I think, sacrificing. We know that for you to have spent this 90 minutes with us, it means you could have been doing other things, but you chose to be on this call. So thank you so much for that. In terms of next steps, the first thing is a few people have been asking if they can still sign up. Yes, they can. You can all still sign up. So the expression of interest form that I spoke about will remain open.
Sorry, Tatenda.
Yes, Janet.
I'm so sorry, man, for raising. Now I know you're closing. I'm just wondering in terms of moving forward, I guess we really need some organizations to drive this process, or else it will remain as just another talk shop. Because if nobody is there to take responsibility, who is going to organize? At least we are grateful that Aphrodite and Oxfam EJN have tried since they were part of the kickoff workshop. But now, if we leave this hanging, I guess we really need to have a concrete resolution around what needs to happen to ensure that we now prefer to call it a core group to avoid, of those hierarchical, so I would really want to move that perhaps we work around the issue of trying to put together a mandated core group to do this, so that it doesn't really just hang out as volunteers. Because if I'm meant to volunteer, and this from the last speaker is actually pushing and advising that perhaps we work around December, would even take care of this, and we lose momentum. By the time we come back in January, perhaps most of the organizations, institutions, we open West Academics, we open in February.
I'm so sorry, Janet. So as part of my closing remarks, what I was going to say is firstly that the EOI form remains open. The second thing is that we're going to be sending an email next week. That email will firstly provide a summary of what was spoken about today and yesterday. So we'll provide that summary to everyone on our database. Secondly, that email will ask, so there'll be some sort of survey which will say, do you want to be involved in the facilitation and not leadership next year? So that's how we're going to identify the core group. So organizations will be able to put their hands up and say, I want to be in this core group. The third thing that email will ask is, what are the timeframes? Are organizations happy to push in December, or is the consensus that we move it up until January? So it's just to say, I apologize for cutting you off, but it's to say that we have been thinking about this. We are going to send an email to say, who's putting your hand up? When do you want to have these meetings? and so on. So yeah, you can expect that email from us next week. I see that there was a hand from Bini Buchori from ICC20 Brazil.
Thanks,
Unfortunately,
Tatenda. I
Yeah.
sent my input in the group, in the chat box, just
okay.
to have a process.
All
Thank
right.
you.
No, thank you so much. And we love the energy. We love the enthusiasm. Please write to us. And similarly for Benny, we know you had your hand up. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I would ask that perhaps you can put your thoughts in writing, and then we will include those within the sort of summary, unless if it's a sort of burning topic where you really feel it's something that everyone needs to hear, in which case we could give you 30 seconds.
Yeah, just sorry.
Okay.
I lost my voice, so I just need to just put it in writing. I cannot speak.
Oh,
Sorry, I lost my voice, so I just write in the chat box. Okay.
okay. All right. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I've stolen 5 minutes of your time. Apologies. But yes, we'll send that update email next week. And let's please keep this energy, this enthusiasm, not just next year, but I think even beyond, because we know the G20 is just 12 months for South African civil society, but we need to make sure that by the end of 2025, we're all in a stronger position as South African, African, and global civil society. Thanks, everyone, and we will be in touch. Goodbye.